The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Redmond shot a coyote off the top of the henhouse and decided she was done waiting for the world to come to her. And then, of course, the world did exactly that. It was the spring of 1882, deep in the New Mexico territory, where the sky stretched so wide and blue it made a person feel both enormous and inconsequential at the same time. The town of Callow Creek sat at the base of the Sangre de Cristo foothills like a hat tipped too far forward, all crooked storefronts and dusty streets and the persistent smell of horse and wood smoke. It was not a grand place. It had not asked to be. But it was hers. Rose had decided 7 years ago, and she had set about making something of it with the same stubborn efficiency she applied to everything else in her life. The Redmond Ranch was 3 miles northeast of Callow Creek's main street, and by the standards of the territory, it was something to be admired. Rose had taken a failing homestead, a dead husband's debts, and 400 acres of rocky scrubland, and turned it into a working cattle operation with 2 hired hands, a vegetable garden that fed half the town in lean years, and a reputation that preceded her wherever she went. She was 28 years old. She had done it all more or less alone. The letter came via the Callow Creek post office, which was a generous title for the shelf behind Horace Penny's general store counter. Horace handed it to her without comment, though his eyes did flicker with undisguised curiosity, because the envelope was postmarked Fort Worth, Texas, and it had a quality to the paper that suggested whoever had sent it was not entirely without means. Rose tucked it into her coat pocket and didn't open it until she was back at the ranch, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and the afternoon light coming in golden and long through the westward window. She knew the handwriting before she finished unfolding it. She had not seen it in 6 years, but some things do not leave a person's memory even when they try. The letter was from a man named Daniel Holt, the older brother of her late husband, Thomas Holt. Daniel had been a good man in a rough-edged way, the kind of man who kept his promises long after it was convenient to do so. The letter explained that Daniel himself had passed in January, a fever that came on quick and did not leave, and that before he died he had written to his attorney in Fort Worth. The attorney's name was Gerald Marsh, and he had written to Rose on Daniel's behalf, but buried in the middle of all the legal language was a sentence that made her set the letter down flat on the table. Daniel Holt had borrowed $500 from a man named Jeremiah Easton 12 years ago, when Thomas was still alive, and the 3 of them had been young and full of plans. The debt had gone unpaid because Daniel had fallen on hard times and then harder times after that, and the $500 had grown with interest in the ledger of Gerald Marsh's office. Daniel, in dying, had pointed the debt toward the only thing of value he had left, which was a small parcel of land adjacent to the Redmond ranch land that Rose had actually been using for grazing for 4 years, because the fence line had never been properly established, and she had assumed, honestly and without malice, that it was hers. The letter informed her that Jeremiah Easton would be coming to the territory to settle the matter personally. Rose read the letter twice more, then folded it, put it back in the envelope, and went outside to check on the coyote-damaged henhouse. She was a practical woman. She would deal with what she could deal with, and she would meet what was coming when it arrived. It arrived on a Friday morning 3 weeks later, in the form of a man on a dark bay horse riding up her lane with the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who had not spent the last several days in a saddle, and was not going to admit if he had. Rose saw him from the top rail of the corral, where she had been watching her hand, a quiet young man named Eli Torres, work a Greenbroke mare in circles. She shielded her eyes against the morning sun and watched the rider come. He was tall in the saddle. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing was that he rode with his hat tipped at a particular angle that suggested he was looking at everything without wanting anyone to know he was looking at anything. He pulled up at the fence and took his hat off with one clean motion, and Rose got her first real look at him. He was somewhere around 30 years old, lean the way men got from outdoor living rather than from want, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had seen a razor recently enough. His eyes, when he found hers, were the color of creek water over pale stone, not quite gray, and not quite green and sharp in a way that made her stand up a little straighter without meaning to. "I am looking for Rose Redmond," he said. His voice was measured and unhurried, a Texas accent smoothed down by travel. "You found her," Rose said. Something moved across his face, surprise maybe, or the recalibration of an expectation, and then it settled into a polite and careful neutral. "Jeremiah Easton," he said. "I believe Gerald Marsh wrote to you." "He did," Rose said. She climbed down from the rail and dusted her hands on her trousers, a habit that had scandalized Callow Creek for a solid year before they gave up being scandalized about it. She wore trousers for ranch work and dresses for town, and she saw no contradiction in either. "I expected you'd go to the land agent first." "Most people do. I thought I'd come to you directly," Jeremiah said. "It seemed more honest." Rose looked at him for a moment. "That's an interesting word to open with," she said, "when the business at hand is a debt someone else borrowed." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I suppose it is," he said. "May I come down?" She stepped back and he dismounted, and she was right about the height. He stood a good head and a half above her, 5 feet and 4 inches, and she was not a short woman. He tied his horse to the fence post with practiced ease and turned to face her, hat in his hands. "I want to be clear with you about what I'm here for," Jeremiah said. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not here to turn you off land you've been working. I want to understand the situation and arrive at something fair." "Fair," Rose repeated. "The situation is that I've been grazing that east parcel for 4 years believing it was part of my property. The fence survey from my husband's original filing put the boundary at the creek, and the whole parcel sits on the other side. I didn't know Daniel had used it as collateral on a debt. I understand that." "Do you want coffee?" she asked, and surprised herself by asking it. He looked equally surprised. "Yes," he said, "thank you." They walked up to the house, and Rose was aware that she was still in her work clothes and her braid was coming loose, and there were likely smudges on her face from the early morning's work. And she was also aware that she did not especially care, and she was further aware that she was thinking about all of this too much for a woman who had a business matter to settle. The kitchen was clean and warm and smelled of the bread she had baked before dawn. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him at the table and sat across from him with her own, and they looked at each other in the straightforward way that people in the territory learned to look at each other when there wasn't time or social convention to look any other way. "How much do you know about Daniel Holt?" Jeremiah asked. "Enough," Rose said. "He was Thomas's brother. Thomas was my husband. Thomas died in the winter of 1876, a horse accident. Daniel came to the funeral, stayed 2 days, and I didn't see him again. He wrote to me once, about 2 years after, to say he was doing well in Fort Worth. Then nothing until the letter from his attorney." Jeremiah nodded slowly. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Daniel borrowed $500 from me in 1870, he said. I was 21. He was trying to set up a horse breeding operation in Waco. It never took off. He paid back $240 over the next few years in small amounts and then stopped. I didn't push him hard. He was in hard circumstances. But the money was real money I'd earned, and I never fully stopped hoping to see it resolved." "What's the total now with the interest?" Marsh calculated. $322 and some cents, Jeremiah said. "I'm not interested in the cents." Rose looked at the table between them. $322 was not a sum she could simply produce from a drawer, not after the winter's feed costs and the veterinary expenses for the 2 cattle she'd lost to illness in February. She was solvent, and she was proud of that, but she was not flush. "The east parcel is worth more than that," she said quietly. "I know," Jeremiah said. "That's why I came instead of sending an agent. I want to settle it fairly, and that means I'd like to hear what the land means to you before I make any decisions." Rose looked up at him. "Why?" she asked. "Because I'm not in the business of taking from people who have earned what they have," Jeremiah said. There was a flatness to his voice when he said it, the flatness of a conviction rather than a performance, and Rose found that she believed him. She told him about the east parcel. She told him that it was primarily used for late summer grazing when the main range got thin, and that she had improved a water source there, digging it out and lining part of it, which had cost her 3 weeks of labor and about $40. She told him that losing access to it would not ruin her, but it would make the next few years harder, particularly if the dry season came in fierce. Jeremiah listened without interrupting, which was itself a thing she noticed. When she finished, he said, "Here is what I'd like to propose. You pay me what you can toward the debt in installments over 2 years, and in exchange I'll sign a use agreement that gives you grazing rights on the parcel for the duration of that period. At the end of 2 years, if the debt is settled, we negotiate a proper purchase of the parcel at fair market price, and I'll credit what you've already paid toward that." Rose stared at him. "You do that?" "Yes." "Why not just take the land and sell it to someone in town? Garrett at the feed store has been trying to get his hands on that east parcel for years." "Because that would be the easy thing," Jeremiah said, "and I've learned that the easy thing isn't usually the right thing." He paused. "And because you improved a water source on it, which means you put real work into it, and that counts for something to me." Rose sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind at the window and the distant sound of Eli talking to the mare in the corral. "All right," she said at last. "That's a fair offer. I'll want it in writing." "So will I," Jeremiah said. And this time the corner of his mouth moved again, and she let herself see it as a smile. He stayed in Callow Creek that night at the one lodging available, which was 2 rooms above the saloon that a widow named Clara Briggs rented out, and kept scrupulously clean despite their location. Clara was 60-something and had strong opinions about everything, and she liked the look of Jeremiah Easton well enough to give him the better of the 2 rooms without being asked. Rose went back to her ranch and stood at the kitchen window longer than she needed to, thinking about nothing in particular except the quality of a man who rode 3 days into the territory to deal fairly with a woman he had never met. The next morning she drove her wagon into town to have the agreement drawn up by the notary, a dry and meticulous man named Arthur Beale, who had strong hands and the neatest handwriting in the county. Jeremiah was already there when she arrived, sitting on the bench outside Beale's office with his hat on his knee and a cup of coffee he'd gotten from somewhere. He stood when he saw her coming, which was a courtesy that made her feel a complicated thing she immediately decided not to examine too closely. Arthur Beale took an hour and 15 minutes to produce the document, during which time Rose and Jeremiah sat in the 2 chairs facing his desk and were offered no entertainment whatsoever. They talked quietly to fill the space. He told her he had grown up in East Texas, that his father had kept horses and his mother had kept books, and he had inherited something from each of them. He told her he had spent the last 6 years doing various things, buying and selling cattle, some land surveying, 2 years as a deputy in a county that was calming down from a range war that had left everyone exhausted and suspicious. Rose told him about coming to New Mexico Territory with Thomas in 1874, the first years of the ranch, the way the land had been hostile and beautiful in equal measure, and how she had come to love it with a fierceness that surprised her. "Were you from Texas originally?" he asked. "Missouri," she said. "Thomas was Texas. We came west together because he had the land grant and I had the sense to know which direction was forward." Jeremiah smiled at that, a full smile this time, and she found she was very glad to see it. Arthur Beale cleared his throat and presented them with the document. They signed it and shook hands, which was a practical and businesslike conclusion to the morning, and Rose told herself that her pulse was behaving oddly because she had not eaten breakfast, which was almost certainly not the reason. Jeremiah did not leave Callow Creek that day. He told Clara he'd stay through the weekend, that he had other business in the area, A man to see about a horse in the next town over, and Clara accepted this without comment, and a look that said she was not entirely fooled about what kind of business it was. On Saturday morning, Rose came into town for supplies and found Jeremiah at the general store in conversation with Horace Penny about the prospects of the next season's grazing. He turned when the bell above the door announced her arrival and said good morning with the air of a man who was genuinely glad to see her and was also making only moderate effort to appear otherwise. "I didn't expect you still to be in town," she said. "I didn't expect to still be in town either," he said, "and yet here I am." Horace Penny watched the exchange with the bright-eyed attention of a man who had been the primary source of local news for 20 years and intended to remain so. Rose bought her flour and salt and the liniment she needed for one of her horses and was carrying it all toward the door when Jeremiah said, "Would you show me the east parcel?" She stopped. "Show it to you. I've been going on descriptions and a survey map," he said. "I'd like to see what the water improvement looks like, what you did with it." It was a reasonable request. It was also a 20-minute ride from town, and it would take most of the morning, and Rose stood there in Horace Penny's store with flour on her sleeve and thought about whether she wanted to spend a morning riding with Jeremiah Easton. The answer arrived before she finished forming the question. "All right," she said. They rode out in the late morning, under a sky that was doing something spectacular with clouds' great white towers building up to the northeast, lit from inside by a sun that turned everything gold. The land between the ranch and the east parcel was sage and red earth and the occasional juniper, the kind of landscape that required a certain willingness to find it beautiful before it revealed itself as one of the most beautiful things on earth. Jeremiah rode beside her without talking for a while, which she appreciated. Too many people felt that silence needed to be filled. She had been filling her own silences for 6 years, and she had learned to like the space of them. "Your land survey," he said eventually, "was it the original Redmond filing or did you resurvey after Thomas died?" "I resurveyed in 1878, she said. "Paid a man named Calvin Foster out of Santa Fe to come do it. It was expensive and worth every cent because there were 2 other parties who were going to challenge the boundaries if I'd left them ambiguous." "Smart," Jeremiah said. Not a compliment shaped like a condescension, a plain statement of agreement. "I found out quickly," Rose said, "that a woman alone on a land holding has to be twice as deliberate about everything as a man would be, because twice as many people are looking for reasons to question whether she ought to have it." Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. "That's an injustice," he said. "Yes," Rose said, "it is." They rode on. The east parcel came into view past a line of low bluffs, a broader stretch of grassland than the main range, with the water source she had improved at its north end. A natural spring that she had widened and deepened and lined with flat stones to prevent the muddy collapse that had made it nearly useless before. She had also built a low earthen berm around one side to keep the runoff clean. Jeremiah rode up to it and looked at it for a long moment. He dismounted and walked around it, studied the stonework, looked at the berm. He crouched down and put his hand in the water, not in any practical way, but in the way of a man who is thinking about what something cost. "This is real work," he said. "About 3 weeks of it," Rose said, still mounted, watching him. "Eli helped with the heavy stones, but mostly it was me. I'll credit the cost against the debt," he said. "Whatever you estimate you spent on materials." Rose opened her mouth and closed it again. "That wasn't part of the agreement," she said. "The agreement was for me to deal fairly," Jeremiah said, standing up and looking at her. "You improved property that we are now treating as mine. It's only right." "You keep saying that word," Rose said. "Right, fair, you believe that?" "Yes," Jeremiah said. "Most men who come here with papers and debts don't come in believing that," she said. "Then I suppose I'm something of an exception," Jeremiah said quietly, and there was nothing boastful in it, nothing performative, just the plain statement of a man who had thought about who he wanted to be and made his decisions accordingly. Rose looked at the water glittering in the late morning light and felt something shift in her chest, quiet and certain as the turn of a season. They ate lunch on the flat stones above the spring, which was either a purely practical arrangement because they were both hungry and the stones were comfortable, or it was the beginning of something, and Rose sat with both possibilities simultaneously and decided she did not need to resolve them immediately. She had packed biscuits and cold bacon in her saddlebag because she always packed food when she rode out, a habit born of necessity in the early years when she had sometimes been too tired to ride all the way back before she needed to eat. Jeremiah accepted the food with visible gratitude, and they ate in the warm noon sun with the clouds still building to the northeast and the grass moving in a slow, easy way around them. He told her about a place in East Texas he had loved when he was young, a bend in a river where the current slowed and you could see clear to the bottom, and how he had found himself thinking about it at odd times in odd places ever since he left. Rose told him about a morning in Missouri when she was 12 and the snow had come down in a way that muffled everything for miles, and she had stood in it and felt absolutely certain for the first and last time in her life that the world was entirely at peace. "Do you miss Missouri?" he asked. "No," she said. "I miss 12 years old, which is different." "That's a fine distinction," he said. "I'm a precise woman," she said, and he laughed, and the sound of it was unexpected and unguarded, and Rose found herself laughing too, and thinking that she had not laughed like that with anyone in quite a while. On Sunday, the clouds that had been building all week delivered on their promise, rolling in over the mountains in the late afternoon, and unleashing a thunderstorm that lit up the sky in green and white, and sent everyone in Callow Creek running for cover. Jeremiah was still in town because the business he had claimed with the man about the horse in the next town had apparently been less urgent than he had suggested, and he was caught in the rain outside the general store. Rose was not in town on Sunday. Rose was at her ranch with Eli and her other hand, a compact and quiet man named Frank Suarez who had been with her for 3 years and was one of the best cattlemen she had ever seen, moving her cattle to higher ground ahead of the storm. It was Eli who rode back toward the ranch house first and found a man on a bay horse sitting in Rose's yard, because he had been caught between the storm and the need to be somewhere dry, and the Redmond ranch was the closest shelter. Eli brought him in without hesitation, because hospitality in the territory was not optional, it was survival, and Frank came in behind them all shaking water from his hat. Rose came in last, soaked to the shoulders despite her slicker, and found Jeremiah Easton sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that Eli had made, looking both apologetic and thoroughly wet. "The storm," he said. "I can see that," Rose said. She pulled off her slicker and hung it on the peg and pushed her wet hair back from her face. "You're welcome to stay until it passes." "I appreciate it," he said. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," she said. "You're wet." Frank and Eli exchanged a look that communicated something with great efficiency, and then found reasons to be in the other room. Rose changed her shirt in the bedroom and came back and made fresh coffee, and they sat through the storm together, the thunder rolling through the hills in great waves, and the lightning whitening the windows every few minutes. It was the kind of storm that makes a house feel very warm by contrast, and they talked through 2 hours of it, ranging over everything from cattle prices to the nature of justice, in a territory where the law was still being invented as it went. Jeremiah told her about the range war he had been deputy through, how it had started over a fence and ended with 8 men dead, and an entire county scarred for a generation. He said it plainly, without dramatizing it, but his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen things they wished they hadn't and had made their peace with the weight instead of trying to put it down. "You said the money Daniel borrowed was money you earned," Rose said. "What were you doing at 21 that earned $500? "Cattle drive," Jeremiah said. "Up from Texas to Kansas." It was 1870, the drives were still going, and the pay at the end was good enough if you kept alive to collect it. "I saved for 2 years and then lent most of it to Daniel because he asked, and I was 21 and full of faith in people." "Was it a bad choice?" Rose asked. lending it or trusting him. Either. Jeremiah considered this with the seriousness it deserved. No, he said finally. Daniel was a good man who went through bad times and made some choices that made the times worse. Trusting him was not wrong. It just didn't pay off the way I hoped. That's different from being wrong. Rose looked at him over her coffee cup. Most people can't make that distinction, she said. I had a long time to think about it, he said. The storm passed around 7 in the evening, leaving the air scrubbed clean and the sky a deep, bruised purple that faded to stars while they were still sitting at the table. Jeremiah stood to go and thanked her for the shelter and the coffee, and he said, the company, which he said simply and without any particular pressure or intent behind it, and which landed in Rose's chest with all the weight it would have had if he'd said something much more elaborate. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride out under the new-washed stars, and then stood there a minute longer than she needed to. In the days that followed, a pattern established itself so naturally that Rose was not sure when it had begun to be a pattern. Jeremiah, still in Callow Creek for reasons that multiplied and shifted whenever Clara or Horace or anyone else tried to pin them down, took to riding out to the Redmond ranch on the mornings when he had no other declared business, and Rose took to expecting him, which she noted and found interesting. He was useful, which she had not expected. He was not the kind of man who stood around watching while work happened, and he did not ask permission or announce his intentions. He simply saw what needed doing and did it, with a competence that spoke of a life lived largely outdoors and in proximity to animals and fences and the 1,000 practical challenges of the working land. One morning, he spent 3 hours helping Frank replace a section of corral fence that the storm had weakened, working in a steady silence broken by the occasional exchange of practical information. Rose watched from a distance and then stopped watching and joined them, and by the end of the morning, the three of them were sitting in the shade of the barn with water and an ease between them that felt like it had been years in the making. "You're good at this," Frank said to Jeremiah, which from Frank was the equivalent of a lengthy speech of admiration. "I've fixed a lot of fences," Jeremiah said. "Where are you from originally?" Frank asked. Frank was not typically a curious man, but he was a protective one, and his questions were the questions of someone who was quietly assessing whether this person was a good thing or a bad one for something he cared about. Jeremiah gave his honest answer: East Texas. The horses and books, the cattle drives, the deputy work, and Frank listened with the still attention of a man taking in information and filing it accurately. At the end he nodded once, which Rose recognized as approval, and she felt something warm and obscure pass through her. Eli was less subtle. "He's a good man," Eli told Rose that evening while they were checking the cattle on the far range. "The kind that knows how to be useful without making it about himself." "I know," Rose said. "Are you going to keep letting him come around?" Eli asked. "He'll be gone soon," Rose said. "He has business back in Texas." Eli was quiet for a moment. "I don't think he's thinking about Texas much," he said, and he rode ahead and left her with that. Rose thought about it on the ride back, under a sky going pink and orange behind the mountains. She thought about the way Jeremiah had looked at her across the kitchen table during the storm, not with any particular overt intention, but with a quality of attention that she recognized, because she felt it herself when she looked at him, a kind of noticing that went deeper than the surface. She had not let herself want much in the way of companionship since Thomas. Not because she was still grieving in the sharp way, but because the life she had built required every bit of herself, and she had not seen how to add another person to it without losing something she needed. She had watched women in the territory marry for practical reasons and end up in lives that were smaller than the ones they had started with, and she had decided that she would rather have her own life, large and difficult and entirely hers, than a smaller shared one. But there was a difference, she was beginning to suspect, between the kind of man who made things smaller and the kind who made things larger, and she was beginning to suspect that Jeremiah Easton was the second kind. It was a Thursday when things shifted. She had ridden out to check on a heifer that had been off her feed for 2 days, and she found the animal down in the south pasture, which was not the good sign she had been hoping for. She sent Eli back for Frank, and for the kit she kept for animal illness, and she was crouched beside the heifer talking quietly to her the way she always talked to her animals, because she believed they understood tone if not words, when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find Jeremiah. "I saw Eli on the road," Jeremiah said, dismounting. "He told me. I know something about bovine fever. He did not ask whether he was wanted." He simply knelt down on the other side of the heifer and put his hands on her and began to assess with the focused efficiency of someone who knows what they are doing. They worked together for 3 hours. Jeremiah had seen the illness before and recognized the signs, and he directed Rose in a calm and clear way that did not feel like directing because he phrased everything as information rather than instruction. "Here is what I've seen work. Here is why. Here is what you're looking for." Frank arrived and the three of them rotated through the work, and by late afternoon the heifer was on her feet and unhappy about it in the way that unhappy animals are when they are going to be all right. Rose sat back on the grass with her knees drawn up and felt the relief go through her in a long exhale. "Thank you," she said. Jeremiah sat beside her, not too close, with his forearms on his knees and his hat pushed back on his head. The sun was going down and it was turning everything that amber color that made the territory look like a painting that was trying too hard. "You've got good animals," he said, "and you know them well. That matters." "I've lost cattle," Rose said. "I lost 4 in the first 2 years when I didn't know enough. I learned from it." "That's how it works," Jeremiah said. They sat there in the amber light while Frank and Eli moved the heifer to the barn, and the quiet between them was the kind of quiet that is not actually empty. Rose was aware of the 6 inches of grass between them with more awareness than she generally gave to 6 inches of anything. "Jeremiah," she said. "Rose." They had not used each other's names until that moment. They had been maneuvering around the formality of it, and now it was gone and she felt the difference of it. "How long are you actually staying in Callow Creek?" she asked. He turned his head to look at her. The light was doing remarkable things to the planes of his face, which she noted and then noted that she had noted and told herself that the light did remarkable things to everything out here, and that was simply a geological and atmospheric fact. "I had planned to stay a week," he said. "I have stayed 3. "I know," Rose said. "I find that I am not in any particular hurry," he said. "No," she said. "No," he said. His voice was quiet and level and carried every single thing he was not yet saying, and Rose heard all of it. "You should come to dinner on Saturday," she said. "A proper dinner. I'll cook something that isn't biscuits and cold provisions." Jeremiah smiled, and there was nothing cautious about this smile, nothing of the corner of the mouth kind she had been cataloging. This was a full, unguarded smile, and it was the most disarming thing she had seen in a very long time. "I would like that very much," he said. On Saturday, Rose made a beef roast with the dried herbs she kept on the kitchen shelf and potatoes from the cellar, and a pan of cornbread, and a dried apple dessert that her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old in Missouri. She braided her hair in a way she did not braid it for ordinary days, and put on the blue dress that Eli had once said looked like the sky. And she stood in the kitchen before Jeremiah arrived, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, a kind of sweet nervousness that was entirely distinct from dread and entirely uncomfortable, and not uncomfortable at all. He arrived promptly, which she had expected, wearing a clean shirt and his hair combed and his boots cleaned, all of which she observed with a pleasure she did not try to repress. He had brought something, a small wrapped parcel from Horace Penny's that turned out to be a jar of honey that Horace apparently kept for the rare occasion when someone wanted to give something that wasn't entirely practical. "From Horace?" Rose asked, turning the jar over. "He told me it was wildflower honey from the hills outside town," Jeremiah said, "and that it was good with cornbread. I got the impression he felt he was providing useful intelligence." Rose laughed. "Horace would have had opinions about what I should serve too if I'd asked him." "He had opinions anyway," Jeremiah said. I didn't ask. They ate at the kitchen table, which was the only table in the house but which was large enough and the food was good enough, and the company was better than anything else. And the dinner stretched out over 2 hours in the way that dinners do when nobody is thinking about finishing them. Frank and Eli were in the bunkhouse behind the barn, having been fed their own supper at a more practical hour, and the house was Rose's own, warm and lit by lamplight. Jeremiah told her about his mother, who had died when he was 17, and who had been, by his account, the clearest-thinking person he had ever known. Rose told him about her father, who had been a school teacher and had given her the stubbornness and the conviction that she was as capable of understanding the world as anyone else in it, which had been a radical gift to give a girl in Missouri in the 1860s. He must have been something, Jeremiah said. He was, Rose said. He died in the war, the summer of 1863. I was 9. She said it plainly, the way she had said it many times, but the plainness of it was not absence of feeling. It was the shape that feeling takes after 19 years. Jeremiah looked at her across the table with the full attention she had come to recognize in him, the kind that meant he was not thinking about what to say next, but only about what she had just said. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the most genuine version of those 2 words she had heard in a long time. "Tell me something," Rose said, because the evening was getting toward the hour when either people became more honest or they went home, and she found that she wanted the first option. "When you came here, when you got on your horse in Fort Worth and rode 3 days into the territory to settle a dead man's debt, what did you expect to find?" Jeremiah was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "A situation," he said. "I expected to find a situation that needed untangling. Possibly someone angry, possibly someone who would try to avoid the conversation. I expected it to be a business matter." "And was it?" Rose asked. He looked up at her. "It became something else," he said. "It became that very quickly." "When?" Rose asked. He considered this with visible seriousness. "When you climbed down from the fence rail the first morning," he said. "You were covered in work and you weren't apologetic about it, and you looked at me like you were seeing exactly what was there and deciding what to do with it." "That was when." Rose sat with that. "I thought you were going to be difficult," she said. "I thought you were going to be difficult," he said. "I can be," she said. "So can I," he said. "I don't think it will be a problem." The thing that existed in the air between them had been building for 3 weeks, and it was very present in the room now, warm and certain as the lamplight, and Rose made a decision the way she made all her decisions, which was to acknowledge what was true and then act accordingly. "I don't know what you are planning," she said, "about the future, about Texas or what comes next, and I am not asking you to tell me everything, not tonight. But I want you to know that whatever this is," she gestured between them with one hand, a gesture that contained 3 weeks of dinners and storms and dying cattle and water sources and every quiet thing, "I am not afraid of it." Jeremiah set down his cup and looked at her across the lamplight, and she saw in his face something very clear and very decided. "I am not afraid of it either," he said. "And I want you to know that Texas is not a pull. Texas is a place I keep things. It is not where I'm going." "Where are you going?" Rose asked. "I think I'm already there," Jeremiah said quietly. Rose breathed. The house was warm and the lamplight was gold, and outside the stars were doing their old extravagant business above the New Mexico territory, and she said, "Then I suppose you should stay." He stayed. Not in the house. There was propriety to consider, and also Rose was a practical woman, and she knew that the right things at the right pace were a form of respect for the thing itself. He stayed in Callow Creek. He took the longer-term arrangement at Clara Briggs's rooms, which Clara was graciously and pointedly delighted about, and he began to make himself useful in the ways that a man makes himself useful when he has decided that a place is his place. He bought a horse from the man he had originally claimed to have business with, a good quarter horse that he stabled at the Callow Creek livery, and he began to establish himself in the rhythms of the town with the unforced naturalness of a man who had been enough places to know how to fit into a new one without demanding that it reshape itself for him. He helped rebuild the schoolhouse roof in April when it was discovered to have developed a dangerous lean, working alongside 6 other men from town over 3 days in a project organized by the school teacher, a determined young woman named Miss Annabeth Cole, who had come from Ohio 2 years ago and intended, she frequently said, to stay until she had educated an entire generation. He introduced himself to the land agent and the banker and the sheriff, a capable man named Walt Dodger who had been in Callow Creek for 10 years and who assessed newcomers with the practiced eye of someone who had made a few mistakes in his early career and did not intend to make more. Walt told Rose afterward that Easton seemed solid, which from Walt was a complete and total endorsement. Rose watched all of this with a feeling that was new to her, or not new but newly available, a feeling that something good was being built, patiently and well, by someone who understood the difference between permanence and stubbornness, and chose it deliberately. They rode together twice a week when the work allowed, and they had dinner at the ranch most Saturday evenings, and they talked with the ease of 2 people who were discovering that they agreed on more important things than they disagreed on, which is the quiet miracle at the center of every real love story. There were disagreements. Rose held strong opinions about water rights and the way the territory government was managing them, and Jeremiah had a different view on one particular element of it, and they argued about it one afternoon with real intensity while riding back from the east parcel where she had been showing him the spring again, now full from the spring rains and better than ever. The argument was vigorous and well-reasoned on both sides and ended with neither of them entirely defeated and both of them slightly energized, and Rose looked at him as they pulled up to the ranch fence and said, "You're not going to agree with me on this." "Not on this particular point," he said. "I respect that," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That's one of the things about you." "One of the things," she said. "I'm compiling a list," he said very seriously, and she laughed and swung down from her horse, and he did the same, and they were standing very close together by the fence, and the afternoon was golden and soft, and he put his hand against her face very gently, a question more than a statement, and she answered it by not moving away, and he kissed her once, careful and sure, and then they stood there in the afternoon light being quiet together for a moment. "I have been wanting to do that for about 3 weeks," he said. 25 days, Rose said. "You counted," he said. "I'm a precise woman," she said. He laughed and she laughed, and the horses stood there patiently, having no opinions about the matter. The summer came on in the way that New Mexico Territory summers came, which was to say with heat that was ambitious and sky that was spectacular and a dryness that required constant vigilance over water sources and cattle range. The East Parcel spring proved its worth in late July when the main range water dropped and Rose moved a third of her cattle to the East Parcel, and the spring held steady, running clear and cold from the stones she had lined it with. Jeremiah rode with her on a hot morning in July to count the cattle and assess the range, and they sat their horses on the low bluff above the spring and looked at the cattle moving unhurried below, and Rose felt the deep satisfaction of something that she had built working the way she had planned it to work. "You're going to be all right," Jeremiah said, "through the dry season." "I know," Rose said, "but I'm glad the parcel is in the agreement." He looked at her sideways. "The 2 years are up in April," he said. "Have you thought about the purchase?" "Every month," she said. "I'm saving toward it. What if there were another way to settle it?" He said, and his voice had taken on a quality that Rose recognized, the quality of a man approaching something carefully because he was uncertain of the ground. She turned to look at him directly. Jeremiah was not looking at the cattle anymore. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen on him before, not quite. Or rather, it was a version of every expression she had seen on him, but gathered into one moment and one purpose. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the land and the debt and the agreement, and I have also been thinking about other things entirely, and I have come to a point where I find they are all tangled together in a way that I cannot separate, and perhaps that is appropriate." "Say what you mean, Jeremiah," Rose said quietly. He took a breath. He was not a man who was easily undone, but he was undone at the edges right now, and she found it the most endearing thing she had ever seen. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "I would like to propose that we settle the debt by simply not having one, because what I would like is to build something here, with you, on this land that you have made into something. And I want to be clear that this is not about the land or the debt. I would ask this regardless, and I would ask you to name any other settlement of the debt that you prefer. This is about you, and about the fact that I rode into this territory 3 months ago to collect on a promise, and I found—" He paused, and his voice was steady, but the steadiness was the practiced kind. "I found someone who had built more than I expected out of harder circumstances than I knew, and who argues with me clearly and thinks with more precision than anyone I have met, and who talks to her cattle and makes dried apple dessert and counts the days since someone kissed her." Rose looked at him. The cattle moved below. The spring ran clear. The summer heat lay across the land like a hand. "You have not spent 3 months in New Mexico territory because of a debt," she said. "No," he said, "I have not." "And you would stay," she said. "This is not a Texas man making a Texas promise he will ride home to." "I have nothing in Texas worth going back to," Jeremiah said. "I have arranged my affairs there. It is done. I am here because here is where I want to be." He paused. "Although I should say that here is specifically where you are, and if you were somewhere else I would be there instead." Rose looked at him for a long moment that felt like its own season. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes," she said again, and smiled, and he reached across the gap between their horses and took her hand and held it with the careful sureness of a man who has found the thing he was looking for. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon sun, and Eli, who was mending harness in front of the barn, looked up and looked at them, and then looked back at the harness with the small, satisfied expression of someone whose predictions have come true. They told Clara Briggs that evening, and Clara put both her hands on Jeremiah's face and told him he was a sensible man, and that she was very glad he had not gone back to Texas when he should have. And then she cried briefly and efficiently and dried her eyes, and told them that they should hold the wedding before the heat broke, because the autumn weather in the territory was too unpredictable. They told Horace Penny the next morning, and Horace shook Jeremiah's hand for a longer time than strictly necessary and told Rose she had made a fine choice, and if he was also thinking about the informational role he had played with the wildflower honey, he kept that to himself. Walt Dodger heard about it before noon, because in Callow Creek news traveled at the speed of a fast horse and a motivated person, and he found Jeremiah at the livery and shook his hand and said, "You're staying then?" And Jeremiah said yes, and Walt said, "Good." And that was the endorsement completed. Miss Annabeth Cole declared it a wonderful thing and organized, without being asked, and before anyone could stop her, the beginning of a community wedding celebration, which was a tradition in the territory because celebrations were too important and too rare to leave to only the people they directly concerned. In August, Jeremiah rode to Santa Fe to retrieve the things he had arranged to have shipped from Fort Worth, which were not many but were the things he valued: his father's surveying equipment, his mother's books, some items of practical use, and the documentation of his financial affairs that confirmed, as he had told Rose, that he had settled everything there was to settle and brought the whole of his life west. While he was gone for those 4 days, Rose discovered that 4 days was a very different quantity of time than it had been before late April. She worked steadily, and the ranch ran well, as it always had and always would, because she had built it to run on competence rather than the presence of any particular person. But the evenings were different. The kitchen table was different. She sat with this new information and found that it did not make her feel diminished or vulnerable. She was not becoming less herself, but that she had apparently, in the natural and irresistible way of these things, been built up into something that included him now. Eli noticed. "You're quieter when he's not around," he said. "I'm always quiet," Rose said. "You're quieter," Eli said. Frank said nothing, but he made biscuits on the third day, which was a kindness he extended occasionally when he felt it was warranted. Jeremiah returned on the fifth day instead of the fourth because the road back from Santa Fe had a washed-out section that added a half-day's ride, and he came up the lane in the late afternoon to find Rose standing in the yard because she had heard hoofbeats, and he swung down from his horse and they stood facing each other in the yard. "You're back," she said. "I'm back," he said. "I said 4 days." "5," Rose said. "The road was out past the canyon," he said. "I went around." "I know," she said. "I was not worried, I was just noting that it was 5. He closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her in a way that had nothing careful about it, which was the second time they had kissed, and the first time it had not been careful. And Rose kissed him back in exactly the same way. And the late afternoon sun was doing its most excessive work on the landscape, and she thought that she was 28 years old, and had built everything she had out of her own hands and her own determination, and she was not giving any of that up. But that the addition of this man to the sum of it was not a subtraction, but a considerable multiplication. The wedding was held in September, the first week of it, when the worst of the heat had passed, and the mornings were cool and sharp, and the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to think about turning gold. The ceremony was in the open air outside the church, because the church itself could not hold everyone who came, and everyone in Callow Creek came, and several people from the next town over came because word had gotten around in the way that word did. Rose wore the blue dress and her hair in a more elaborate version of its usual braid, pinned up with a ribbon that had been her mother's. Annabeth Cole had pressed it for her that morning and declared her perfect, which was not a word Rose applied to herself, but which she accepted with more grace than she might have a year ago. Jeremiah wore a new shirt and his best jacket, and he cleaned his boots to a shine that reflected the morning sun. And when Rose walked toward him across the dry yellow grass with the mountains behind her and the sky doing its most extraordinary blue, she saw his face do something that she would not tell anyone about because it was entirely his, belonging to the private person behind the careful surface, and it was the most honest expression she had ever seen. They said the words in front of Walt Dodger, who had a Justice of the Peace certification that he used about once a year, and the words were the traditional ones, simple and enduring, and Rose said them with a precision and intentionality that made Jeremiah's jaw tighten in the way it did when he was feeling something strongly, and was not going to let it override his composure. When Walt said the final words and they were done, the assembled people of Callow Creek produced a volume of celebration that startled a bird from the cottonwood tree above and sent it wheeling into the blue, and Clara Briggs cried again, more at length this time, and even Frank Suarez smiled with one side of his mouth, which was a significant event. The celebration lasted the afternoon and into the evening, with food that half the town had contributed and music from 2 fiddles and a guitar that appeared from somewhere, and dancing in the street because it was Callow Creek, and that was how things were done. Jeremiah danced with Rose with more skill than she had expected, and she told him so, and he said his mother had been of the opinion that a man who could not dance was a man who could not listen, and she had taught him carefully. "Smart woman," Rose said. "The smartest I knew," Jeremiah said, "until recently." She stepped on his foot slightly, deliberately, and he laughed and she laughed, and the evening was warm and full of the sound of people celebrating a thing that deserved to be celebrated. Clara Briggs gave them the better room that night, as a wedding gift, which she announced with ceremonious satisfaction, and Horace Penny gave them a box of goods from the store with a card that contained his warmest good wishes and also several opinions about cattle feed, because Horace was constitutionally incapable of separating the personal from the practical. In October, Jeremiah moved his things from Clara's rooms to the Redmond ranch, a process that took one morning and produced a modest but telling redistribution of the house's spaces. His mother's books on the shelf beside Rose's, his father's surveying equipment in the small room off the main hall that had been storage, his hat on the peg beside hers at the door. It was the hat peg that got her. She stood in the entry looking at the two hats side by side and felt the weight of the ordinary miracle of it, the way two lives can extend toward each other and make something new without either of them ceasing to be what they were. "Are you all right?" Jeremiah asked from the main room. "More than all right," Rose said. The autumn was golden and busy. The cattle needed moving and sorting before winter, and with two of them working at it, and Frank and Eli as well, it went better and faster than any year since Rose had been running the operation alone. Jeremiah brought his surveying skills to a property question that had been nagging at the ranch's southern boundary for years, a question about where the grazing rights ended relative to the public land, and he resolved it with clean methodology that Rose studied with admiration and had him explain twice. "You should do this professionally," she told him after the second explanation. "Survey work. There's more need for it in this territory than there are people qualified to do it honestly." "I've been thinking about it," Jeremiah said. "The territory is still being mapped properly. There's honest work in that." "Then do it," Rose said. "You have the equipment and the knowledge." He looked at her with the expression that meant he was taking something in and giving it real weight. "Would it suit the ranch?" he asked. "The travel involved sometimes for survey work." "The ranch suits itself," Rose said. "It did before you arrived. What I'm saying is that you should do the thing you're good at and want to do, and we will make it fit." She paused. "That is how we are going to do things. Not you arranging yourself around me, both of us arranging around both of us." "You have thought about this," Jeremiah said. "I think about most things," Rose said. "You knew that." "I did," he said with that full smile, the one that had been disarming her since April. "All right. Then I'll write to the territorial office in Santa Fe." He wrote the letter. The territorial office wrote back. The work began in the spring, quiet professional work that complemented the ranch rather than conflicting with it, and which also meant that Jeremiah's knowledge of the land around Callow Creek became unusually detailed, which turned out to matter in ways neither of them expected. November came with a cold snap and a conversation they had not yet had out loud, though Rose suspected they had been having it in quieter ways all autumn. They were in the kitchen one evening, the first real fire of the season going in the hearth, and Rose was looking at the account books and Jeremiah was at the other end of the table working on a survey map, and the comfortable silence between them was exactly the right kind of silence. "Jeremiah," she said. "Rose, how do you feel about children?" she asked. He set down his pencil. He turned to look at her, and she looked back at him without particular expression, waiting. "I would like children," he said, with simplicity and directness, because those were the registers he operated in and she knew them now. "I would like them in the context of a life I am glad to be living, which is this one." He paused. "How do you feel about them?" "I have wanted children for a long time," Rose said. "I thought for a while that it might not be the thing that happened to me. I have made my peace with different versions of the future at different points." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I am not at peace with those other versions anymore." Jeremiah reached across the table and took her hand in the way he had taken it on the bluff in July, the same careful sureness, and said, "Neither am I." They did not need to say anything more about it. Some things are made real in the saying, and some things are made real in the silence after, and this was the second kind. The winter settled in over Callow Creek and the territory with the usual authority, and the ranch went into its winter rhythms. The tighter management, the hay stores, the shorter days and longer evenings. It was a good winter, as winters went in the territory, without the brutal cold that sometimes descended from the north and tested everyone. The cattle came through well. The East Parcel spring didn't freeze over, which Rose had been quietly anxious about, and which Jeremiah declared with satisfaction was a function of good engineering as much as luck. In December, they celebrated their first Christmas in the way of the territory, with a simplicity that was also a kind of richness. Frank and Eli joined them for a Christmas dinner that Rose made into something extravagant by the standards of the ranch kitchen. And Clara Briggs came out from town in a borrowed wagon because Rose had insisted. And Annabeth Cole came too, because she had no family in the territory, and Rose had decided that was unacceptable. Jeremiah produced from somewhere a bottle of good whiskey and a box of sugar candies that had come all the way from a confectioner in Santa Fe, which he gave to Rose with the gravity of a man presenting a significant gift, and which made her laugh in the best way. They had managed a small pine tree from the foothills, which they decorated with strips of colored paper and some small carved figures that Jeremiah had made in the evenings over the preceding weeks, which Rose had not known he was making, and which she found extraordinarily moving when they were produced, carved animals for a ranch in the New Mexico territory, made by a man's hands in the lamplight. The year turned to 1883 without ceremony, but with the full awareness that it was a new thing, and Rose and Jeremiah both felt the rightness of standing at the beginning of a year together when they had not stood at the beginning of a year together before. In January, she told him. They were in the kitchen, as they were for most of the important things, which was fitting because the kitchen was the center of the house, and the house was the center of the ranch, and the ranch was the center of everything she had built. She said it plainly, as she said most things, and she watched his face while she said it. He stood completely still for a moment, and then something happened to his expression that she had not seen and could not quite describe, a breaking open of some deep and quiet joy that had been waiting behind the surface, and he crossed to her in 2 steps and held her carefully with his face against her hair. "I am very happy," he said, which was barely adequate to what was on his face, but it was true and precise, and she accepted it. "So am I," she said, into his shoulder. Frank Suarez, when told, was silent for a moment and then said, "That's good," which was exactly the right amount for Frank. Eli was insufferably cheerful about it for a solid week, which Rose bore with grace. Clara Briggs cried. Annabeth Cole began knitting something. The spring brought the survey work and the cattle work and the busyness of the warming season, and Rose worked as long as she could work at full capacity, and then modified her work as her body required modification, which she did with the same pragmatic intelligence she applied to everything else and without particular complaint, because she was not a woman given to complaint, and because the pregnancy was not a complaint, it was the furthest thing from it. Jeremiah hovered at the boundary between attentiveness and over-attentiveness with admirable self-awareness, catching himself when he crossed toward excessive concern and pulling back, because Rose had made clear in her gentle but unambiguous way that she was pregnant and not incapacitated, and that she knew her own body and its limits better than anyone. He surveyed 30,000 acres of territorial land that spring, and was commissioned by the land office for further work in the summer, and he came home each evening to the ranch with the day's work in him, and the welcome of a house that was genuinely and deeply his own. In May, the debt formally entered its 2nd year according to the written agreement, and Rose had been making her monthly installments with perfect consistency, and Jeremiah looked at the ledger one evening and said, "You have paid more than the outstanding principal." "I know," Rose said. "I intended to." "The agreement was for installments over 2 years," he said. "I wanted it done," Rose said. "I didn't want to enter the 3rd year of this ranch's life with you still holding a debt over it, even a theoretical one." She paused. "The east parcel is mine now as of this month." Jeremiah looked at the ledger for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it is." He closed the ledger and pushed it to her. "Full ownership, as agreed." Rose took the ledger and held it and felt the satisfaction of a closed circle, a thing begun and completed, debt paid and promise kept. The east parcel that she had grazed and improved and relied on was fully and legally hers. The water source she had built was hers, the spring was hers, and none of it had been taken or diminished. It had been earned and settled and made right. "You should register it with the land office," Jeremiah said. "I'll ride in Monday," Rose said. "Then you could survey it formally for the registry. "I could," he said. "It would be the most thorough survey that particular parcel has ever had." "Is that a conflict of interest?" Rose asked. "Monumentally," Jeremiah said, and she laughed, and he pulled her carefully toward him and kissed her temple. The summer came in hot and proud and full of work, and in late August, under the same spectacular New Mexico sky that had been witness to all of it, Rose gave birth to a son. He was born at the ranch with the help of the town's doctor, a capable man named Dr. Lyle Hatch, who had been practicing in Callow Creek for 15 years. And with Annabeth Cole present because Rose had decided she wanted a woman's company, and Annabeth was practical and calm and did not panic. It was a hard labor and a long one, and Jeremiah spent 8 hours on the porch with Frank and Eli in various states of barely controlled anxiety. And when Dr. Hatch came out and told him he had a son and that Rose was tired but entirely well, Jeremiah put his head in his hands and breathed for a long time. They named him Daniel Thomas Easton, for both of the men whose debt and history had brought them together, which was a quiet acknowledgment of the crooked ways that good things sometimes arrive. Rose held him in the lamplight of the bedroom with her husband sitting beside her on the edge of the bed, and they looked at this small and entirely specific person who had arrived into their hands and their lives, and their ranch on an August night in 1883. "Hello," Rose said to him, softly and practically, and with all the love she had. Daniel Thomas looked at her with the unfocused and extremely serious expression of a person who has just arrived somewhere important and is taking his time forming an opinion. "He's going to have opinions," Jeremiah said. "Of course he is," Rose said. "He's ours." Callow Creek welcomed Daniel Thomas with the warm extravagance of a small community that takes all its occasions seriously. And for several weeks, the ranch had a steady stream of visitors who brought food and knitted goods and opinions about child-rearing which Rose listened to with practiced patience, and then disregarded in favor of her own clear-eyed assessment of what the child in front of her actually needed. Clara Briggs came nearly every other day for the first month and was genuinely useful, having raised 3 children of her own in a harder time and place than this. Horace Penny gave them a quantity of supplies that constituted a generous gift by any measure, and bundled it with a card that contained his warmest wishes and also several opinions about the best age to begin a child on solid food. Jeremiah was, Rose discovered, a natural father in the way that some people are not fussing or performing at it, but simply present and attentive, and able to hold a small person with the same steady competence he applied to everything else. He got up in the night without being asked. He learned the particular pitch of each different cry with the focused attention of a man surveying new territory and wanting to read it accurately. He talked to Daniel Thomas the way Rose talked to her cattle, in a quiet, even voice that assumed comprehension even when comprehension was not yet on the table. Rose, watching him with their son, felt something she was not going to call by its name in the middle of the night, because the middle of the night was no time for large emotions. But in the morning she looked at her husband across the breakfast table with Daniel Thomas in the crook of her arm and said, "You are a good man, Jeremiah Easton." He looked up from his coffee. "You are a considerable woman, Rose Easton," he said. "Redmond Easton," she said. He smiled. "Redmond Easton," he agreed, without hesitation or complaint. The years that followed were the years of building in the fullest sense, the slow, patient accumulation of a life that knows what it is. The ranch grew, carefully and sustainably, adding a small hay field in the 2nd year and improving the main barn in the 3rd. Jeremiah's survey work established itself as a legitimate and respected practice, and he eventually took on a part-time deputy assistant in the form of a young man from the next town over who had the aptitude and the interest, and needed the professional guidance. The East Parcel Spring became something of a local landmark, cited in the new county survey as a reliable water source in a region where reliable water sources were worth noting. Rose was more pleased by this than she admitted to anyone except Jeremiah. In 1885, Rose gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Clara, the second name for Clara Briggs, who cried so hard upon being told that Horace Penny came running from next door thinking something was wrong. Clara arrived with a slightly shorter labor and a considerably louder opinion of the world, and turned out to be, from her earliest days, a person of extraordinary determination, who would eventually give her parents exactly the same quality of gray hair that they had together given everyone else. Daniel Thomas grew into a boy who had his father's steady temperament and his mother's precision, and who from the age of 4 could tell you the Latin names of 3 different grasses and which of them the cattle preferred, information he had absorbed by the simple expedient of paying attention, which was the family method. In the winter of 1885, 3 months after Clara arrived, Rose sat in the kitchen in the early morning while both children were still sleeping and the house was quiet and the fire was going, and she wrote a letter. She wrote it slowly and carefully, because it was not a practical letter but a personal one, and personal letters required more care than practical ones. She wrote to Daniel Holt's attorney, Gerald Marsh in Fort Worth, and she told him that the debt had been settled and that the circumstances of its settlement had produced, by an extraordinary route, the best years of her life. She told him that Daniel Holt, in pointing the debt toward the east parcel, had done a thing that he could not have predicted, and that she was grateful for it in a way she did not know how to express directly to a dead man, but was expressing now to the next closest thing, which was the man who had managed his affairs. She was not sure why she wrote the letter. She was sure that it was necessary. She sealed it and set it on the hall table to go with the post, and went back to the kitchen and poured herself another coffee, and sat in the early morning quiet of a house full of people she loved, on land she had earned and fought for and improved and made into something. And she felt the deep wordless rightness of a life that had arrived, not easily but truly, at the place it was supposed to be. Jeremiah came downstairs while she was sitting there, moving quietly in the way he had learned to move in the morning so as not to wake the children, and he saw her at the table with her coffee and the letter on the hall table, and he came to the kitchen and poured his own coffee and sat across from her. "Early," he said. "I was thinking," she said, about how strange it is," she said, "the way things arrive. You came to the territory for a debt. I was not expecting you." "I was not expecting you either," Jeremiah said. "I was not expecting anything that has happened since April of 1882. Do you have regrets about it?" Rose asked. Not anxiously, but with her characteristic directness, the desire to know things clearly. Jeremiah looked at her across the kitchen table in the early winter morning, with the fire going and the coffee hot and the 2 children sleeping upstairs, and he said, "Not one." "I want to say something to you," Rose said. "Say it," Jeremiah said. "I built this ranch alone," she said. "I made every decision and I paid every bill and I solved every problem alone, and I was proud of that and I am still proud of it. I want you to know that I do not love you because you helped me carry the weight. The ranch carries itself. I love you because you looked at what I had built and you saw it clearly and you were glad about it, and you came in and made yourself part of it without trying to make it yours. That is not a small thing." Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. The fire settled in the hearth. "Rose," he said, "I came to the territory to collect on an old promise. I found a woman who had kept every promise she had ever made, better and more completely than anyone had any right to expect." He paused. "I would like to spend the rest of my life finding out what else she is capable of." Rose looked at her husband across the table and felt the full measure of everything, the hard years and the solitary ones, Thomas's death and the debt and the drought years and the livestock lost, and the money tight and the loneliness that she had learned to fold into productivity rather than despair. And then the late April morning when a man on a bay horse had come up her lane with his hat tilted at a particular angle. "You'll find quite a bit," she said. "I expect so," he said. "I'm looking forward to it." The morning light was coming in the kitchen window now, the first thin, cold light of December, and in a few minutes one or both of the children would wake, and the day would begin with all its useful and ordinary demands. The East Parcel spring was frozen over this week, but would run again in the spring, as it always had since she had lined it with stones. The cattle were in their winter configuration, and the hay stores were good, and the survey work had 3 commissions waiting for the new year, and the ranch accounts showed a balance that represented 8 years of determined effort, and not a dollar of it owed to anyone. Daniel Thomas made a noise from upstairs, the pre-waking noise that meant he would be down in 10 minutes. Clara would follow shortly after, with the volume and conviction that characterized her waking hours. Jeremiah finished his coffee and stood, and Rose finished hers and stood, and they looked at each other in the morning light of everything they had built and chosen. "Ready?" he said. "Always," she said, and the day began. The spring of 1886 brought with it the formal completion of the East Parcel Survey in the Territorial Registry, recorded under the name of Rose Redmond Easton, noting the improved water source and the established grazing rights and the corrected boundary measurements. A clean and permanent document that said plainly what had taken years to become true. It also brought Daniel Thomas's first attempt at riding the gentlest horse on the ranch, a gray-muzzled old mare named Patience who had seen enough small humans to maintain her philosophical calm, and it brought Clara's first extended opinion-giving, delivered at table in a volume and specificity that made Frank Suarez nearly choke on his coffee and Eli Torres put his face in his hands in helpless admiration. It brought, too, a letter from Annabeth Cole announcing that she would be marrying a quiet man from the next town over, a carpenter named George Whitmore, who had been coming to Callow Creek for 6 months on various pretexts, which had fooled no one, and Rose wrote her back a letter full of warmth and practical advice, and a sincere expression of the happiness she felt for a woman who had come to the territory alone and made herself essential to it. Clara Briggs was 70 years old in the spring of 1886, and in excellent health and full of opinions about everything, and she had become in the years since the wedding something between a grandmother to the children and a 5th family member to the household, arriving twice a week with fresh-baked goods and staying for the afternoon and being generally irreplaceable, and Rose had stopped trying to imagine the situation without her. On a warm evening in May of 1886, Rose and Jeremiah sat on the porch of the ranch house in the late light, Clara asleep inside and Daniel Thomas running one last noisy circuit of the yard before his bedtime, and the mountains doing their long evening business against the western sky. Jeremiah had a survey report on his knee that he was not reading. Rose had her account books on her knee that she was not looking at. They were doing what they often did in these evenings, which was to be present in the same place in the same comfortable way that requires no explanation to the people who are doing it and no other people. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Jeremiah said. "Tell me," Rose said. "That first morning," he said, "you on the fence rail looking at me like I was a situation to be assessed." "You were," Rose said. "I know," he said. "I remember thinking that whatever I had expected it wasn't this." "Was that good or bad?" Rose asked. "Good," Jeremiah said. "Very considerably, thoroughly, and completely good." Daniel Thomas came to a stop at the foot of the porch steps, breathing hard from his circuit, and looked up at them with the clear dark eyes that were his father's exact eyes in his mother's face, the territory's particular combination. "Is it time?" he asked. 5 more minutes, Rose said. He turned and ran again, in the way of a small person who has 5 minutes and intends to use all of them. Rose looked at the mountains. The sky was going that particular deep blue it achieved just before the first stars, the blue that had been one of the things about this place that had settled into her when she first arrived with Thomas in 1874, a young woman from Missouri who had never seen mountains and had not known until she saw them what she had been missing. She had built a life here. She had built it out of difficulty and determination, and the stubbornness of someone who decided that the land was hers and acted accordingly. She had kept every promise she made to herself and to this place, and she had done it more completely than anyone had a right to expect, alone, in the way that required. And then a man on a bay horse had come up her lane with an old debt in his pocket and a quality of fairness in his voice and a smile that he kept at the corner of his mouth until he had reason to let it out fully. She thought about what she would have said if you had told her in April of 1882 that the man riding up her lane would be her husband within 6 months, and the father of her children within a year, and the steady presence in her kitchen and her bed and her life for everything that followed. She would have told you that she was a precise woman and she did not engage in speculation. And then she would have watched him ride up the lane and felt the thing she had felt then and tried to call it something more manageable than what it was. "Jeremiah," she said. "Rose," he said. "I'm glad you came," she said. He turned from the mountains to look at her. The last of the day's light was on his face, and his eyes were the color they always were, creek water over pale stone, and they had been looking at her for 4 years now with a quality that she would never take for granted because she knew the difference between being looked at and being seen. "So am I," he said. "I didn't know what I was coming to. I knew I had a debt to settle, and I thought I was coming to settle a debt." He reached over and took her hand on the porch rail. "It turned out I was coming to find the one place in the world that was entirely right to be." The stars were coming out now, one by one, and then in the sudden abundance they achieved when the sky fully committed to night. Daniel Thomas made his last circuit and came up the steps with the gravity of a person accepting the end of an era. "All right," he said, with the dignity of someone who has run his 5 minutes completely. "I'm ready." Rose stood and took his hand, and Jeremiah followed them in from the porch. And the door closed on the May evening, on the mountains, on the east parcel with its spring running clear in the dark, on the surveyed land and the registered deed and the settled debt, and the years of work that had preceded all of this and made it possible. Inside, the lamp was lit and the house was warm, and the life they had built together was entirely, solidly, beautifully present, not promised, not in progress, not yet to come, but here, now, real and entirely theirs.